Well, the things we have to understand is we have to go back even further. Um, the United States has been seeking the destruction of Russia since the end of the Cold War. We do not want a strong Russia. We want to keep Russia down. That's why the United States reneged on its promise not to expand NATO. Almost immediately, once Gorbachev left office, the United States began the process of expanding NATO, even though we promised the Soviet Union that we would not do so. And those promises carried over to Russia. Even Boris Yeltsin, who pretty much a hand-picked American stooge, protested against the expansion of NATO because, he knew his generals weren't happy. Nobody was happy. He said, "Why are you expanding NATO? This is bad for Russia. It makes me look bad when I say I want to cooperate with the United States." Bill Clinton ignored him. George W. Bush ignored all, Gorbachev. Putin after that. Russia could say, "We don't want this expansion," but the expansion occurred no matter what. In 2008, NATO had a summit meeting in Bucharest, I believe. And at that time, they made an announcement that said, "We want to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO." And Russia said, "This is a red line." They said, "We can't allow this to happen." The U.S. ambassador to Russia at that time, a guy named William Burns, today he's the CIA director, he wrote a memorandum. The title of it was "Niet means Niet." No means no. And what he was saying is, when the Russians say no about Ukraine joining NATO, they mean no. It is a red line. And he warned people that if we continue to go down this path, Russia will invade Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose the Crimea and the Donbass. This memorandum was written in February 2009. William Burns knew then what would happen. He wrote this memorandum to the National Security Council, to the President of the United States. Who was president at that time? Barack Obama. He ignored the warning. They instead decided that they were going to embark on a policy of regime change. Now, they didn't call it that. They called it reset. You remember the Russian reset, the nice, beautiful yellow box with the red button and the misspelled word?
Yeah.
But what did reset mean? Reset means we're willing to work with Russia as long as it's led by Dmitry Medvedev. Because in 2008, Putin's second consecutive term as president expired. Constitutionally, he could not continue to be president, but he knew that Russia wasn't ready for a democratically elected person because the United States was buying off the opposition. So he entered an arrangement with Medvedev, who was prime minister, and they switched places for a 4-year term. The United States wanted to exploit this, to go to Medvedev and say, "Look, you're president. Why don't you stay president? Why don't you kick Putin out of power? You stay president and we'll do anything you want us to do." But what they're really saying is, why don't you stay president and become weak like Boris Yeltsin so we can return Russia to the 1990s, subservient to the will of the United States. Medvedev didn't fall for the bait. Putin was reelected. And from that point on, the United States entered into an active policy of regime change. Manifested itself in February of 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, or coup, in Kiev, where they ousted the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, replaced it with this revolutionary government dominated by ultra-nationalist Nazis, the right sector, Sloboda, people who worship Stepan Bandera and the odious ideology that he embraces, came into power, and they began the immediate persecution of Russians. Remember Putin's speech, 2005. Russians were homeless. Russians were disenfranchised. And now it's playing out in front of his very eyes as ethnic Russians are being burned to death in Odessa, being persecuted in the Donbass, run over by tanks, raped, murdered. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't intervene and go to war. He did provide military assistance, but he was looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. Trust me, if Russia wanted to absorb the Donbass, they did absorb Crimea because historically it is Russia, and they just weren't going to give that strategic base in Sevastopol to the Ukrainians in NATO. So they took Crimea. Ukraine opposed, NATO opposed, the United States opposed. But when it came time for Donbass, which is very strategic, by the way, lots of minerals, coal, etc., they declared independence and they said, "We'd like to become part of Russia." And Putin said, "No, you're part of Ukraine. We have to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, but what we will do is work diplomatically with the French and the Germans through something called the Normandy format. They came up with the Minsk II agreement. Ukraine signed on to that agreement. It wasn't forced on them. They signed on to it. But when the Ukrainians came back, these Nazis told their leadership that if you ratify this, if you do this, we will kill you. We will hang you by the neck until dead. We will give you a new Maidan. And so they didn't ratify it. But now we found out another reason why they didn't. Petro Poroshenko, former president of Ukraine, the man who famously or infamously gave a speech where he said, Ukrainian children will go to kindergarten and school. Russian children will hide cowering in their basements while we shell them. And for 8 years, Ukrainians did shell the Donbass. 14,000 people dead, many of them civilians, many of those people children. When the people say Putin started this war on February 24th, no. Ukraine started this war by oppressing the Russians and then spending 8 years shelling them. But it wasn't just Ukraine, because as Poroshenko said, Minsk II was a sham. It was never going to be implemented. It was a smokescreen so that Ukraine could buy time to have their army rebuilt by NATO so that they would be able to forcibly retake Ukraine. And that rebuilding process began in 2015 when the United States built a permanent training facility on Ukrainian soil where every 55 days we trained 1 battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards and then shipped them off to the Donbass to kill Russians. We bragged about it. So for 7 years, we trained Ukrainians to kill Russians. We built up this army. And what we saw in late 2021, early 22, the Ukrainians started to mass these forces in eastern Ukraine. Anywhere from 60 to 100,000 were massed, ready to launch an attack that was going to begin in early March. Indeed, prior to that, they'd begun escalating their artillery bombardments of the Donbass positions, something that's registered in the OSCE observers who were there. They noticed that the increase in bombardment, a dramatic increase, not a little increase. Now, here we are talking about war. What was Russia talking about? Peace. Russia wanted a peaceful resolution. Russia wanted Minsk to be ratified. What did Minsk II do? It required the Ukrainian government to simply modify their laws so that the Russian language and Russian culture would be respected in the areas where Russians lived. It didn't say that Donbass was going to become independent. No, it said the exact opposite. Donbass was going to be part of Ukraine. But it did say within the Donbass and other Russian-dominated areas that these laws that suppressed Russians would not apply, that they would be waived for the Russian areas. That's not asking a lot, but the Ukrainians wouldn't do it. The Russians begged over and over and over again, ratify, ratify, ratify. Indeed, if you take a look at the militias in the Donbass, they began reducing their numbers, going to near peacetime footing, even though they're being shelled every day, because they said there's no reason for us to maintain this large fighting force if we're looking for a peaceful solution, which is another reason when the Ukrainians built up their forces, 60 to 100,000, the total number of troops in Donetsk and Lugansk was 10,000, no more. So we're talking about a 6 to 10 to 1 advantage. They were going to roll in and capture it. Russia pleaded to the United States to implement this. In June of 2021, Putin met with Biden in Geneva. And one of the things they talked about was the need to implement, and Biden promised that he would get on it, told the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, get this thing moving. But they didn't mean it because Blinken met, didn't do anything. In November, the Russians met with the French and the Germans and asked them straight up, are you going to implement Minsk? And they said no. And that's when Putin realized that this was a sham, that it wasn't point. He made one last effort in December. On December 17th, they promulgated 2 draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which talked about a new European security framework, et cetera, and the resolution of the Ukraine crisis through permanent neutrality and the implementation of Minsk II. Nobody wanted to talk about it. He had no choice. On February 24th, confronted with the reality that nobody wanted a peaceful solution to this, confronted with the reality that this NATO army that had been trained was massing, they started their shelling. They had the plans to show they were going to start attacking in early March. Under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Putin implemented preemptive self-defense. It's a right inherent in international law. One only needs to look up the Caroline Affair, I believe of 1836, 38, somewhere around there. And it applies to this day. When a threat is manifesting itself of an imminent and urgent nature, a nation doesn't have to wait to be attacked. They're allowed to preemptively respond. And that's what Russia did. They preempted the Ukrainian assault on the Donbass. That's what happened. This isn't Vladimir Putin, his brutal aggression, unprovoked aggression. No, the Russians tried everything possible to seek a diplomatic solution to this. It was the West that ignored them, the West that was seeking violence. The West was seeking violence. That's what everybody needs to understand. Well, I don't think they started out to go to war with Russia per se. I believe the United States, together with their European allies, believed that massively sanctioning the Russian economy would cause so much political difficulty for Vladimir Putin inside Russia that he would have no choice but to stop the military action and withdraw from Ukraine in defeat. It wasn't so much that NATO, the United States, and Ukraine was going to militarily defeat Russia, is that we were going to politically defeat Russia, sanction Russian economy, including the energy sector, bankrupt the Russian economy, devastate the Russian society, enforce a popular movement that led to a Moscow Maidan, a revolution that ousted Vladimir Putin. That was the goal. That was the objective. That was the hope. It backfired. Of course, Russia not only was not disrupted meaningfully by the sanctions, Russia prepared for this, had a plan for it, and they reversed it on the West. It's now the West that's being destroyed, especially Europe being destroyed by the impact of the sanctions. The lack of Russian gas is destroying European economies. So they failed. Now they were in a desperate situation because Russia wasn't going to be defeated economically. Now they have to figure out a way to defeat Russia militarily, and they do that by supplying Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of military equipment, underwriting the Ukrainian economy, again, with billions of dollars of monetary infusions. And the goal here isn't to have Ukraine win. The goal is basically to hurt Russia so badly that Russia would never again try to undertake something of this nature. The United States, sadly, is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. And that's a tragic statement because the Ukrainians have not shown a willingness to give up. So they're willing to fight. Tens of thousands more will die on top of the tens of thousands who have already died, but it's in a losing cause. Russia's not going to lose this war. Russia's winning, and Russia's going to win.